Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. This week, we're back with Dr. Brittany Lane. Last week, we left off. She was starting to tell us about some of the barriers in research as it relates to Black women's health. Join us now as we continue the conversation.
I don't want to lose this thought in talking about the research, right? Which you mentioned, Black women are underrepresented. And are they underrepresented from lack of willingness to participate, or are they underrepresented from lack of researchers wanting to focus, or is it a combination of both?
I think it's a combination. I think, again, social determinants of health, looking at the systemic racism, looking at those structural forces that have impacted Black women's decision to participate in research. We have had, trauma surrounding throughout our whole history research, especially as it relates to Black women. And so them choosing not to is not being uninformed. It's because of what people have experienced, what we've had in generations have experienced in research. It wasn't always for us. It wasn't something that we benefited from. We actually were hurt and traumatized from it. So re-educating our communities and letting them know that there have been things put in place, policies that have been put in place that protects the rights of individuals, specifically Black women, people of color, vulnerable groups, to help make sure that they are more comfortable participating in research, making sure that we're answering questions that people have. I know that there are some researchers, like you mentioned, I said it's a catch-20. There are some researchers that are not empathetic to that fact. They just want you to participate in their research. They don't think you need to know much about it other than providing the consent information. And you could tell by the nature of the researcher, they're not trying to engage you or to alleviate some of the concerns you have. And so I think by addressing those things, making sure that Black women are informed of the policies and procedures that are put into place to protect their rights, and also making sure that they know it is their decision. We want you to make an informed decision. We want you to make a safe decision. And here's the information that you need. But I do think it's both on the researcher in terms of the way they engage Black people and the lack thereof. And it's also on the part of, the ignorance or the lack of knowledge as it relates to research now in this current climate.
Yeah, I think you touched on it because I was going to go to the point of the Tuskegee Airmen, and that entire experiment was certainly one of the founding reasons why we have such research in place. And I think it's really a great point for listeners who don't understand the review boards and the research process to maybe not necessarily extreme detail, but kind of break down the requirements to do research. And Dr. Lane, you can speak to this. Doing any type of research with human subjects, even when it is not medical, probably even more so when it's medical and any type of intervention-based research, like just wanting to survey some college students was a process. It's a very lengthy process. It's very detailed. You have to be very specific. But maybe you can add a little bit more as it relates to medical research and what is required for someone to officially conduct medical research. And maybe that will help our listeners to understand that review and approval process that's a part of it.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of what Joycelyn said, yes, any kind of research that we're doing with human research, we have to follow a very strict protocol. And that is the same as relates to, and we do mostly social, behavioral science, that sort of type of research, but that specifically relates to clinical research, clinical trials, medication, treatment, and things like that. She mentioned the Tuskegee Airmen as being one of the situations or a major situation that happened in our history, especially toward Black people in our communities, as being a reason why people don't trust the research process, which is very understandable. But there's also something that had happened in our history as it relates to gynecology in its infancy. Black women were used to study gynecological procedures, even without their consent. They had to endure a lot of medical procedures that were very unpleasant, very scary surgical procedures that they were testing out at the time. They used Black women to do it. That has also been in our history. So the source of distrust is not unwarranted. And so whenever I'm having discussions with people, especially with older generations, I don't dismiss the fact that they have these concerns. What I do is help me to help you. What is it that I can tell you to kind of alleviate your concerns? And I ask them their questions. One thing that I also think is extremely important as a research scientist, and what I mentioned about community engaged research essentially involves the people that are benefiting from the research throughout the entire research process. So the research that I do when it concerns Black women, even when it concerns Native Americans, ensuring that I'm involving those that will be impacted by this research throughout the process, throughout the development of the research questions, throughout figuring out the methods, how are we going to disseminate the information, even when I'm analyzing data, because maybe I have a different level of knowledge as it relates to data analysis. I also review it I have a select team and I review it with them and I say, hey, this is the interpretation I got from it. Can you explain this to me? Does this make sense? Or I didn't really understand why I'm seeing this. Can you explain a little bit to me why that makes sense? Or how does this make sense to you? And including them in the research process, it allows you to kind of gain buy-in from the community. So if you're working with Black women should be included in the research. If you're working with Black men should be a major part of the research. And because of that, they trust their peers. I trust my peers. I'm more likely to trust my peers. So making sure that you are including those people that are benefiting or impacting from the research that you're doing throughout the entire research process is very instrumental, and it does help to encourage participation for that project and also future research projects. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned again, of course, how Black women are represented in research, and specifically that they're underrepresented in the research. And we talked a little bit about the importance of Black women being willing to participate in research and clinical trials and things of that nature, but also acknowledging that there's, certainly a deeply rooted distrust. But research aside, when we look at the health disparities, what are some things that we should be thinking of? How should we, because I think what I heard is that the importance is us being willing to advocate for ourselves when it comes to these rooms. That's the consistent thing that I've heard from individuals who've experienced issues, whether it's maternal mortalities, even around cancer. Or I have a close family member who suffered from breast cancer, and she eventually had to advocate for herself around saying, no, I feel something.
Right.
This is something. And then just actually getting a second opinion. How do we empower more of that? How do we have more of those conversations?
I think first things first is to understand what it is that Black women need, what it is they feel like they don't understand, what they don't know about their own health, maybe about their health status, conditions that they're high prevalence amongst Black women. We need to make sure that they're educated first, increasing awareness, increasing education. Also, like you said, empowering them to be advocates for their health. First explaining to them the problem, assessing their needs, questions that they may have, and then providing them with information and tools that they can advocate for themselves. And that's really what's going to help us in this context in which we're dealing with the health disparities, specifically as it relates to Black women, is we need to be advocates for ourselves. But we can't advocate for ourselves if we don't have the knowledge. So we must first impart the knowledge and then provide the tools, whether it's communication, negotiation, or assertiveness skills, and just letting them know their rights and what they have, their rights, and the aware of the privileges that they have when they're seeking care, making sure that they're aware of all of those things that are available to them. Also, if you're not able to advocate for yourself, because there are some people who find that challenging, find someone you can connect to, a support person, a friend, a colleague, a family member that can accompany you to these appointments. It's that dire, it's that important. So we do need to make sure that people understand that if you can't do it, and that's understandable, some people are not as assertive and their own experiences have prevented them from being advocates for themselves. Make sure that we can help them find someone that they trust that can accompany them to these appointments so that they can advocate for themselves. Because apart from changing policies, apart from dismantling structural racism, that really is one of the major tools that we have in our pockets today.
Yeah, is advocating for ourselves. Absolutely. Yeah. You also mentioned like research and just in the education. How can our listeners, what are some resources and tools that they can use to better understand, let's say, some of the topics, you said diabetes, stroke, like what are some resources, free resources specifically, that we can use to learn more about these things and what to look for and what to ask about?
I really do think that Black women and just our community in general have done a really good job about focusing our efforts on bettering the lives and the well-being of Black people. And I say that because we have so many organizations that have been created and started by people of color that provide education on these issues that are plaguing our community, specifically health issues. I can name a few. There's the Black Women's Health Imperative. That's an organization that I think they're based in Atlanta, and they're specifically focused on addressing those health issues and addressing health disparities in Black women in the United States. Also, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I know that, some people have a little bit of a side eye with the CDC, especially as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic, but they are a great resources in terms of providing information in a way that people can understand it. There are fact sheets on, leading cause of death. There are fact sheets on how to prevent certain health conditions. And again, I would encourage people to do their research on organizations that have been created by Black women for women. Because they do provide great education. But the one Black Women's Health Imperative is a great starting point. Also, IWES, which is based in New Orleans, International Women in Studies, is an organization that was started by a Black woman. And she has, information about issues affecting Black women, women of color, actually. So with those three organizations, you should be able to find all the information you need.
Awesome. And so you've talked a little bit about your research, but tell us a little bit more in terms of what's next, or what is your focus in terms of research, and what are some of the things that you're working on?
So, what's next for me? Currently, I have been working as a PhD in the industry of public health. So, we have both the academic side and we have the industry of public health. I've been working in the industry. I am making that transition in a position in academia. The reason being is, as a Black woman in public health and having experienced my path to this career, I noticed that there is a need of more representation for Black women in the university setting that have an interest in addressing racial and health disparities. So that is what's next for me. I'm also in the process of creating my own organization, which will address health disparities, specifically that amongst Black women internationally. So spending time and making that transition to academia, also spending time creating that organization that will provide information on how do we address these health disparities, because not only are Black women in the United States experiencing a higher burden of disease, Black women in the entire world are experiencing a higher burden of disease. And because I love the international effect of public health, I want to combine those interests and work on improving the health, not only in my own community, but in the communities worldwide. So that's what's next for me. I'm looking forward to the change and focusing more on that.
That's awesome. So congratulations on starting your own organization. You'll definitely have to keep us posted on that, and maybe we'll have you back on once I get started. As we sort of wrap up, what is it that you hope listeners take away from today's conversation?
I don't want it to seem like such a grave conversation. Like, we do have hope. We've made significant improvements in terms of improving the health of Black women. We have progressed significantly from 100 years ago. But we also need to make sure that people are aware that there's still work that needs to be done. And I want people to be encouraged to go out there and to continue to do the work, because it's helping. We are making that impact. We are improving the health of Black people, of Black women, but we still have work to do. And I also want them to understand that even if you're not in public health, you still have a role to play. If you have the information, you should share the information. You should share the knowledge. You should vote for policies that are leaning towards health equity, not health inequity. You should hold your politicians accountable when you see that they're going in a way that doesn't provide health equity for people of all groups. You should not just sit there and say, this is a problem. I don't really agree with it. You need to do something. And even that is just a conversation. That could be in a conversation with your colleague of color. That could be a conversation with your colleague that's white. We still just need to have the conversations, even if you, by training, aren't in public health. You can also help.
Yeah, you said some really great things that I wanted to touch on. The first being the fact that, we have come a long way. I do want to make sure that everyone understands, the centering of this podcast is really to just discuss all these different things, but I want to be clear, the goal is not to necessarily, like you mentioned, be doom and gloom. The goal is to also talk about where we need to go, but also how far we've come. And I want to make sure that we celebrate that. So what are maybe a few bright spots that you'd share in terms of where we as a community overall have come in terms of progress around health and health outcomes?
As a community, specifically as it relates to health outcomes, I think we're on the same page. I think the main issue that we're having is lack of awareness. And I think people are more willing to talk about it. They don't shy away from discussions about racial and ethnic disparities. They don't have issues having these conversations about the inequities in health and socioeconomic status. And because of the way that society has affected Black communities, a lot of times we didn't feel like we could talk about it. And because the doors are opening, we're seeing, more opportunities. We're seeing that we have a power, though it's not in the place in terms of it being equal, but we do have power in certain settings and that we're not afraid to use our voice. I also think that we are also not afraid to work with other groups. In order for us to have a lasting impact, we do need to work with other groups. We as Black people have issues that we need to address, but we can't do them by ourselves. We have to include our, Asian counterparts. We have to include our white counterparts. This is something that we have to work together to address in order for it to be sustainable, in order to have that impact. And I think now we're seeing that. We're seeing how things have evolved in our communities, sadly, as it relates to race relations, the policing, and how we're seeing other communities step and come on board and help. And we're seeing the impact that we're having as a unified group versus an individual. And there are issues that people can discuss regarding that. But the reality is, the connectedness that we're seeing between groups is what's really fueling the work that we're doing. And we need that. And we're not afraid to do that now. And we're more willing to do that now, I think. And that's really helping us.
That's awesome. That's good to hear. And then the second part I wanted to touch on was voting and policies and things. So what are a couple of things that should be on people's radars as they think about upcoming election cycles and health?
Definitely voting for access to healthcare. Like we said, in terms of socioeconomic status, those are the people that are mostly impacted, that are carrying the higher disease burden, and those that are of lower socioeconomic status usually are not insured or underinsured. They find it difficult to access healthcare. And so by making sure that we have affordable healthcare for all, of course, it's going to differ depending on the person and their socioeconomic status, but making sure that everyone is able to access quality healthcare is extremely important in addressing health issues. In addition to that, education, promoting education, increasing access to education. And that really does start with the residential policies that we have, making sure that we are aware of what's happening in our communities. We see certain things as relates to residential segregation, making sure that we're speaking out against different zonings and the way that they're zoning communities for education for residences, because that has a significant impact on the health of children and the health of families in terms of the resources that they're able to access. And even in terms of the food that they're able to access as it relates to healthy food versus junk food. So those things are extremely important, making sure that we are voting at the local level. I think some people don't realize how much of an impact local elections have compared to the bigger election. The local elections affect the bigger elections. So we need to make sure that we are voting in our communities, that we are aware of the issues that are going in our communities, that we don't just turn a blind eye and say, oh, okay, they're changing the zoning for that. There's nothing wrong with it. Oh, they're closing this school. Make sure that we are aware of how these things impact our communities, and that we are advocating and holding our politicians accountable and making sure that we're thinking of our community, Black women, Black men, when we're voting and advocating for these rights and these laws.
Yes, great point around local politics and voting and policies. And while I know that you're currently sitting in Louisiana, but of course we're both from South Florida, and so thinking about our home state, and it's not just our home state, but thinking about how certain politicians and certain parties are addressing education and the things that they want to remove versus the things that they want to include. And one thing that comes to mind for me is sex education, right? And I think this probably definitely ties into a lot of your prior research and work around infectious diseases. What are your thoughts as it relates to the importance of sex education in our school systems and how that affects, outcomes in the work and research that you do?
It's extremely important. So my expertise isn't necessarily in sexual health education, but just as a public health professional, comprehensive sexual education, I'm an advocate for. Kids are having sex at younger ages. They need to be equipped with information. Providing people with information is not necessarily encouraging more sexual activity. It's providing people with information so they can make the right decisions as relates to sexual activity. And they can protect themselves when they're engaging in sexual activity. I myself did not have a formal sexual education experience. Fortunately, I did go into this work, and so I ended up kind of educating myself. And coming from a person that has a strong religious background in terms of my family and even myself, I know the benefits of sexual education and the importance of comprehensive sex ed as relates to young people, because the decisions that they make at a younger age will affect their entire life. So making sure that we're providing protection to our young people, that we're giving them the information so they can make better informed decisions, so that they can have better health outcomes. And not only at this point in time in their life, but throughout their entire life, will benefit our communities as a whole. And not only the Black communities, will benefit the entire community as a whole.
To that point, how do we debunk the myth that by informing and educating, it will then turn into acceptance or encouragement of practicing? And I say that because I think about, again, here being Florida, there's a lot of things they want to exclude from education, CRT, certain sex ed stuff, and even, excluding discussions around sexual orientation, et cetera, with this assumption that it is somehow going to encourage more people to then want to practice, or that you're saying that you should then go off and do this thing. Like, how do we debunk that myth? Because you mentioned having a spiritual background. I do think that exists still, unfortunately, today in a lot of our religious sectors, but also that idea of including that. Like, how do we encourage people that education is important and that it should be offered in schools versus the assumption that parents are covering these things or whatever communities are covering these things, and that the child should get it based on what the parent thinks that they should get?
I think in Florida, of course, is definitely a challenging situation. Again, this is why it's so important, one, to educate ourselves, to make sure we are aware of the issues, and also advocate for policies and also support politicians that are advocating for policies that are helping to improve the health of the community. To debunk those sorts of the myths in terms of sexual education, increasing sexual activity, research. And sadly, in some situations, it's not always accepted. And that's why we have to make sure that we are a part of the conversations, that we are a part of the voting, and making sure that we are voting for those people that can advocate for us, because we can provide the research. Public health researchers have done so. There's data that shows that it doesn't increase sexual activity. It just helps protect and making sure that people are making the proper decisions as it relates to sexual health. But it's not always accepted depending on the politician that's in place at the time. So we definitely need to make sure that we are making ourselves aware of the situation, and also encouraging people to vote, people from our communities to vote. And again, increasing awareness in our communities.
Yeah, and I was going to just add, I think it's important to that our community organizations and our pillars in our communities, like our churches and things, should also be willing to ensure that this type of education, or at least even if they don't feel comfortable in facilitating, but ensure that there is support of that information and that type of information sharing. And I say that because I think back to your earlier example of what made you want to look into HIV and AIDS. And you mentioned that as this woman was essentially pouring her heart out and educating, that individuals like just walked out and left the church. And with the church still being a pretty large pillar in the Black community, how do we change that? How do we have these conversations that remove the idea of shame being associated with health? And also just sharing health information within our families. Talk about the fact that we don't talk enough about historical health challenges in our family. So a lot of us don't even know what's hereditary. And I'm not sure if that's maybe part of some of the outcomes. But
you basically hit everything on the mark. Exactly what you said is awareness. We need to include, when I talk about community engaged research, I'm also talking about those organizations that are very influential in our community, especially faith-based organizations, including them in the discussions, including them in the activities, even including them in research, right? We can include them and they can educate, they can increase awareness, and they would improve the participation as relates to research. They have to be a part of the discussion. We need to understand what are some of the concerns they have, and we need to provide with factual information. You know, this is X, Y, and Z, and this is addressing the concern that you have, and figuring out a way how we can work together so that we can educate the communities, because there are a lot of faith-based organizations that are on board as it relates to sexual health, as it relates to HIV prevention. Yes, they may have certain parameters. They may not want us to use certain languages. We also have to respect that. But ultimately, our goal is to improve the health of our communities, and we all play a part in that. Everyone plays a part, not just public health professionals. Teachers play a part, even you with your background, you know, in financial literacy and financial education, you play a part. And so we have to make sure that we know that we all play a role in improving the health of our community and coming down and having those discussions. And yes, we'll have concerns, we can air them out, but making sure that we know the common goal is to achieve that health equity, specifically as it relates to our own.
And how do we get away from, because I have a separate episode around financial shame, but how do we get away from the idea of shame and even maybe just the secrecy that has been kept around health issues in our communities, which at the end of the day aren't contributing to the health outcomes because we have no idea that we are predisposed to certain things because we don't have family members sharing with us, sharing with the younger generations what they have experienced, sometimes until it's too late. Like, oh yeah, I had that. Like, how do we address that? I don't know if it's shame.
I think it's not necessarily always shame, depending on the condition, right? I think it's more so about a child's place. I think, you know, Black people cultural, in terms of our culture, they like to keep things secretive. They think that you're the child and you don't need to know. And even I've experienced that, you know, we've talked about this time in and out. I've experienced that in my own family, and it is detrimental. It's detrimental to health outcomes, especially as it relates to reproductive health. There are conditions that have gone through generations that women have experienced in families that younger generations have no clue about. And when it becomes their turn, they're shocked. And then they hear, oh, well, your grandmother had X, Y, and Z. But had they known, they may have prepared for it. I think we have to do podcasts, things like you're doing, educating people. Again, it starts with education. It starts with awareness. Some people don't realize how detrimental those things are to family. And making sure that we have those conversations. We're also a mouthpiece. We have the information, we have the knowledge, making sure that we're sharing it through our platforms. Social media is huge. I think we can use that as a platform to provide, whether it's scenarios, skits, education, informing people of the detriment of having these secrets in families as it relates to health, and how we can promote health by sharing and having these conversations with our families. Diseases that are usually that come with a high stigma and shame, such as HIV and AIDS and other conditions, sexual transmitted infections, is really just the education. I think the more people know about conditions, the more They realize that they're not alone, that there are also people who have been infected and have dealt with certain situations, and they're living normal lives, specifically as it relates to HIV. It is not a death sentence like it used to be. People are living normal lives. People are having children. People are raising families. They're living fulfilled lives, and making sure that we're making people aware of that. It's just really comes with conversation.
Yeah. And to the point of sharing, I want, listeners to know, to the point of advocating and also sharing information, is asking for those things. So asking our parents about their health history, and as much as they may know. One thing I do want to give some credence to, and be empathetic with our lack of family knowledge, is some of it we just didn't know. Like, some of our ancestors didn't have access, didn't have the progressive access to healthcare that we do now. And so a lot of them sometimes went undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. So there is just some information that is simply just not known. But for our parents, right, who know, asking them about their health experiences and starting those conversations is what certainly I'd recommend. And once you know things that are predisposed, then asking for those things. So in annual health exams, if you know that your mom or your dad had or has high cholesterol, high blood pressure, make sure that they are running those things. Black women tend to have fibroids a lot. I personally have fibroids. Making sure that when you're getting your annual checkups, you're asking about them. Like, I have to go out of my way to say, hey, how are they looking? Like, is it something I should be concerned about reproductively, just in general? Have they grown? Like, what is happening with them? Because those are the types of questions that you have to ask. And I'll be honest, they don't offer that information. I literally have to go out of my way to ask that. From a cancer screening, I did it to start doing early screening for both mammograms. There is and I forget what it's called, but there is a pre-screening that people can do through like a questionnaire and such, and they'll identify based on familial history, what is your likelihood to be predisposed to certain types of cancers. And so based on that, then they'll determine whether or not you should start early screening for things. And we know that it's the idea of, breast cancer and starting to screen at 40 years old. I had too many people that I know, family members included, who've been diagnosed with breast cancer way before 40. So starting those processes and procedures early, asking the questions. And for those who don't know, just go to your doctor and ask them. I forget the name of the test, but ask them if they have option for a risk assessment when it comes to cancer. And you can do that, and depending on what your assessment is. And they do a thing where they determine based on the degree of closeness of you and said family member who had whatever it is that they had, whether or not they're going to start screening you. Now, granted, it's not for all cancers, but it is available for certain ones. And that's definitely something that wasn't, available in the past. So I want to, and being transparent, offer that to our listeners, that those are some of the things that they can do. I'm not sure if there's anything that you want to add from your own, experience of.
And see, I learned something from Joycelyn in terms of that screening. I have never had that done, and I didn't even know that existed. So it's important to have these conversations. And again, to those that don't know, we don't always know. I didn't know about asking about reproductive health issues throughout my, generation, from my grandmother and my mother. I didn't know until I sat in a conversation, and that was the advice that was given. So it is important to have these conversations. Some things that I would add, and some of the things that I've done throughout my life in terms of finding physicians, is understanding that you don't have to stay with the physician. If you feel like this physician or this provider is not serving you in a way that you think they're, empathetic towards your needs, or listening to you, going out of the way to make sure that they're assessing you for the health, especially those diseases that you may be more prone to, you can find someone else. Just know that you're not stuck. You can also ask for recommendations. That's what I've done. I've asked people for recommendations. I have, and this is just a personal preference of mine, though I've had, positive experiences with Caucasian or white providers, I've known that I've had better experiences with people of color. So I personally have tried to find Black women as gynecologists, Black women as dermatologists, and just so that I feel more comfortable and that I can have discussions. And don't get me wrong, sometimes they may not be a perfect fit either. So again, they're not, don't feel stuck, find someone that is. But that's some advice that you could take just to make sure that your physician is advocating for your health, and that they're really doing what they need to do to make sure that you are staying healthy and that you are preventing diseases that many of which are preventable.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great point. Don't stay stuck. Just because you have a provider, if it's not a good fit, you don't feel like they're listening to you, or if you started with a provider, let's say that start somewhere. Definitely make sure
Yes,
that you're getting your
yes,
annual exam. For Black
right.
women, make sure you're doing your annual well woman's exams, doing your self, breast examinations, because breast cancer is still very prevalent among Black women.
Mhm.
And also just doing your annual exams where you're running your blood work, you're understanding where your thyroid levels are, because that can affect a lot of hormonal things, your glucose, all of those things. But also, if you start with someone who's, maybe that was your doctor, that your mom's doctor, your dad's doctor, and that's okay to start there. But also understand if they aren't a good fit for you, then it's okay to find a better
Yes,
professional who's going
absolutely.
to ask questions, who's going to have the conversations. The other thing is, which a lot of doctors don't do, unfortunately, call them and ask them about the results. Ask them to send
Right,
you a copy of your results so you have the information and
right,
that you can look at it and try and digest it and then ask some questions,
right,
because they'll tell you things are normal. And they're like, oh, well, actually, it's been inching up. Or at least you can say, okay, I noticed my glucose levels have been increasing over the last several years. What do you think is happening there? Is this diet? Is this whatever? But make sure you ask for the information, because they'll call you back and be like, everything looks normal. But what
right.
is normal, right? Like, and give me the
Exactly.
information so that I can review it
See it.
and sort of dissect and comprehend it. Would
Absolutely.
definitely be my advice.
Yes, indeed. Great advice.
Well, this was such a great conversation, Dr. Lane. I appreciate you, friend, for taking the
Friends.
time to chat with me. If there's any quotes or books that you wanted to leave as resources for our listeners.
So one quote, and as you can see, was kind of in terms of the way that I work and the way that I think of Black women's health and the way that we need to address Black women's health is, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. And I believe it's a Helen Keller quote. And I think that really explains what's necessary in terms of public health. Together we can do so much, but I can't do it by myself. You can't do it as a financial expert by yourself. Educators can't do it by themselves. We have to do it together as a community, and not only in our respective fields, but also community as people, different cultures. We have to work together to address these issues. We cannot do it alone. And I think that that's the takeaway I would like to present to all that are listening.
And last but not least, for those who want to follow you and your work and research, how can they connect with you via websites or social media?
Best way to connect with me at this moment would be through social media, which is my Instagram profile, which is Dr. Brittany, Brittany, Lane, Lane, my name. And yeah, just add me on Instagram.
Okay. We'll include that information in the show notes. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Lane. We'll definitely have to have you back to continue to unpack some of the health disparities among Black women. But thank you for sharing your knowledge and just sharing your passion and having the conversation, because that's the goal of this podcast, is just to have the conversations that may be a little bit more taboo, if you will. So thank you again for joining. I know that our
Thank you for
listeners got
having me.
Absolutely. I know our listeners got a wealth of information from this episode, and we'll be in touch.
Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race Wealth Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.